This is Steve Brule with Studio Brule, and I'm here with Bettina Arndt, who is a psychologist and sex therapist, sex researcher in Australia, who also gave keynote address speech at the International Conference on Men's Issues in Australia in July, June, I should say, earlier this month. Welcome, Bettina.
Hi, Steve. Sorry,
Bettina is our newest contributor here.
Yeah, I'm very pleased to be here.
Well, I was thrilled to see your video on the sexless marriage, or rather, how did you put it? Husbands.
Sex-starved husbands.
Sex-starved husbands, yes. And apparently this is quite a common problem.
A major problem. In most, I don't know very much about non-Western countries, but it's certainly in Western countries, it's a major issue. Yeah.
And
have you got a problem there?
Your ICMI talk also touched on this topic as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is one, because I started off my career as a sex therapist, it's always been a topic that's very dear to me, and I've watched over 40 years a huge shift in how sex is managed in a relationship, how the sex supply is managed. And I thought that was a nice place to start, because it very much illustrates the whole issue of the shift in power between men and women in their personal relationships. The fact that women's needs and wants are constantly discussed. We never hear the end of them. And this big issue for men, which is sex in their marriages, just never gets a look in. And I thought that was a very nice point to start about. I talked about all the men's issues I'm really passionate about, but I did start off with sex.
Well, you know, when I watched your video, the sex-starved husbands, I have to say a lot of stuff rang true for a lot of people I know. And, you know, men do talk about this in private amongst themselves, hush, hush, you know. Yeah, what was the response you received at ICMI when you brought up this topic?
Well, it was interesting to me how many people said that they'd never heard it discussed at all, but particularly never heard it discussed in terms of men's rights. And I think feminists have done a really good job in dampening discussion around this issue and in being absolutely outraged when this is talked about as an issue which is all about denying men some basic aspect of their existence, just some basic issue that's really important to them. And to see it in terms of men's rights, of course, is a total red flag to the bull. And, you know, a lot of people commented on that, and they were really surprised that it actually hadn't been mentioned in that sort of context before.
Well, one of the things that came to mind to me is that that's been drilled, I guess, for 30 years that I can remember, is that there shouldn't be, and it would be wrong to have an expectation of sex in the marriage. It's always, every iteration or every instance is a new instance, and you should not expect anything. Is that something you've seen changed, that's changed recently? It didn't used to be like that, right? I think you mentioned in your video that there was an expectation that there would be intimacy in a marriage at one point in time. When did that change and why?
Oh, it was a very deliberate change. I mean, there is still an expectation that couples will look after each other. And we talk, and if you go to a marriage counselor, or if you read the women's magazines, there's endless discussion about give and take in a marriage and looking after each other's needs and so on. But it was a very deliberate decision on the part of the women's movements back particularly around the 1960s, to say sex is special. Sex is not part of that equation. And I was there and I was watching that and I thought it was just fascinating. The point I always make, it did come from a good place. It came from the discoveries, you know, the people in the 60s, the feminists talking about rape in marriage and talking about the fact that there was a legal assumption that a man had a right to sex in a relationship and the woman had no right to withhold it. And, you know, that I think rightly, everyone decided that was a pretty unreasonable position if we wanted some sort of equality in relationships. And, you know, women had a right to say no. And that's where it all began. But how that morphed into this idea that women can say no for 20 years and that's perfectly fine. I mean, that's been the most extraordinary thing to witness.
But how common was it, or do you have an idea, like this idea that marital rape, it still seems to me that that was likely a very uncommon thing. Was it a big issue prior to the 60s? Was it like a common thing?
Look, it's an interesting question, because how do you sort out marital rape in the sense of man forcing himself on a woman from a mutual expectation that a man had a right to sex in a marriage? There was the idea of conjugal rights, the idea of sex as a wifely duty, where there is a lot of shade of grey there. A lot of women who might think, oh, well, you know, it's just what women do. It's just expected. One of the things I'll do for him, even though I might not feel like it, because he does lots of things for me. Is that rape? It came to be defined as rape when a woman gave in reluctantly to sex, or gave in because she, you know, was doing it for him. That came to be seen as a total no-no. But within there, I think there was a lot of behaviour. I mean, the assumption is that that was all horrible for women. And that's something I really wonder about now, this assumption that women were lying back and think of England and suffering through this unwanted sex. I suspect if you look at what the research is now showing about women who don't have spontaneous desire in relationships, all the evidence is there is a proportion of those women who will still enjoy sex once they get going. And if back in the 1950s, you thought, well, this is just what women do, even though I might not feel like it, well, that's what, you know, happens in a marriage. I think there were probably a lot of women then who enjoyed sex, even though they didn't start off looking forward to it. And we never hear about that, do we?
No. Now, here's another question for you. In your research, my suspicion is that a lot of men will have sex when they don't want it, just because of the woman wants it. Did you find any of that? Or will do something they don't really want to do of a sexual nature, and you can imagine what some of those things might be, but the wife or girlfriend wants it, so they do it. Why is that not? Does that happen very much? And why is that not the same stigmatized thing?
Oh, well, that's because feminists control the debate, isn't it? And define what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. There's no question men do lots and lots of stuff sexually, just to please women, just to try to get some sex for a start. I mean, what man in his right mind would want to, you know, go down on a woman until his jaw is totally aching? I mean, that sort of stuff. Hours of foreplay. It's I mean, some men love that, but I think a lot of times it must be a bit of an ordeal for a man, particularly when he's with a woman who doesn't come very quickly. In my sex video, I've got this cartoon, which is of course very naughty, showing, you know, the skeleton, the man going down on the woman until he's passed away. And I think that's hilarious. It's total. I used to have a Facebook page and put things like that up until Facebook banned me because they didn't like the content I was posting. But I mean, it says something. I mean, there's a wonderful quote from an old. She was a columnist in Britain about 40 years ago, and she talks about the fact that, you know, that the big gap between women and men's idea of perfect sex, and, you know, that it's easier for a man to screw 1,000 women in his lifetime than to try to please one. And that women, you know, it's a very good idea to, summing up of this whole issue, because she says our way of sex is wonderful for us, but it's not what men would prefer. And there's no question most men would prefer to go to bed with a woman, who's really eager for them, who really wants them, and who comes at the drop of a hat. I mean, what man in his right mind would want to go in for an hour of foreplay before he can even get between her legs? And yet we're being told, well, aren't they lucky to be allowed to do this to us? I mean, it's nonsense. And the reality is women are really hard to please sexually. Not all of us, but a lot of us. and it's extremely hard work. You not only have to get us in the mood, which is almost impossible, you need, you know, this I talk about this idea of damp wood. You need perfect conditions for it to light. And we don't get perfect conditions most of our lives. It's, you know, it's the last thing at night. We're exhausted, we're tired, we're distracted. The kids are out driving the family car. There's all this stuff going on in our lives. And for women, that any of that can be enough to turn her off. And so for the men to keep that little flame alive is a mighty big task, let alone to give her pleasure. And women are appalling at teaching men how to give them pleasure and giving proper instructions. And I mentioned a little bit of that ad in my video. You know, I have a chapter, you know, my book on sexual desire has a whole chapter on the whole business of trying to please women. And the chapter is called "The Blind Man in the Dark Searching for a Black Cat That's Never There." And that's a man who spent 20 years trying to stimulate his wife's clitoris, and he never got it right. And I love this image of him peering in the dark, you know, wondering what on earth, when he'll ever hit the jackpot. And that is the reality for a lot of men. We're bloody difficult to please. We want one thing at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, but Wednesday morning we might want something else altogether. And unless we're prepared to tell the man what we want at that time, how in the hell is he supposed to know? You know, so I really, as you could see, feel very sorry for men because they're not getting the sort of sex they would really prefer, which is why pornography is so attractive. Pornography is full of willing women with their legs apart who are dying for it, you know, and who come easily and, you know, and come during bonking. They don't need all this endless clitoral stimulation and all that stuff. No wonder pornography is easy. Women are really hard work. There you go.
The video that we posted of yours, the sex-starved husbands, there's quite a lively discussion, and it goes off in quite a range. I'm sure you saw some of the comments on there. Some of the men, or I presume men, or maybe women commenting, I didn't check, no way to know the gender, but they mentioned that, is it possible that that there's something psychologically in women that becomes uninterested sexually when the man is sort of in the bag? She owns him. She knows she owns him. Now he's no longer sexually attractive to her because of that. Is there any truth to that in your mind?
Well, I did talk in the video about this idea of limerence. This work by a woman called Helen Fisher, who talks about, she looked at this early stage of the relationship with a couple of first in love and finds there's a different brain chemistry then. And that will artificially enhance a woman's libido. And so the charitable explanation is that women tend to get involved with a man and when they're in love with him, or get married to him when they're in love with him, and that means they're going to have this artificial boost to their libido. And then Fisher finds that only usually lasts a couple of years. And then you get back to the normal balance of brain chemistry and hormones and so on. And for most women, that means a distractible libido, a libido where, you know, it's like the damp wood I keep talking about, you know, you need everything going for you in order to feel sexually aroused or feel sexual desire. So I think that's probably part of the story. But the other part is that psychological thing of it. Yeah, you know, we're married. No, why do I need to bother? Why do I need to get myself in the mood for sex? Why do I need to keep him happy? You know, he's stuck whether he likes it or not. And there is an element of that. I was always interested in the fact that cohabiting men get more sex than married men. And that's because the door is still ajar. I mean, I found I don't know how solid that research is, but I did see that somewhere.
Well, you know, I just would like to insert something into that. Sorry?
Yeah, he can still escape then, you see.
Exactly.
So you can't afford to turn the tap off.
Well, one thing I wanted to insert into this, and I've heard this from quite a number of men, and I've seen this happen to female friends of mine. When the man is, say, lost all of a sudden. He's gone because he's fed up or whatever, or the relationship craps. And then all of a sudden, not always, but frequently enough that it sticks in my mind, the woman all of a sudden is so attracted to this guy, no other guy will do.
Yeah.
But she wasn't interested in him when he was so available. Now he's no longer available. Boom, he's the most sexy guy in the world.
Yeah.
That kind of plays into the comment that we're seeing on your video, that women lose interest in the guy who is interested in her, or is trapped by her,
or who's a doormat. I mean, the doormat issue, when men are captured and you've got them exactly where you want and they've got nowhere they can go. I mean, I think there is a solid argument that sort of passive man, particularly the man who's groveling all the time, trying to get sex, begging for it, pleading for it, that's all most unattractive to many women. And I think what comes into there is the whole issues around game. The fact that we obviously you know about Steve, the whole pickup stuff. And I mean, I think there is a real element that dominant men who keep something back, men who don't let themselves be totally controlled by a woman, are more sexually attractive. And particularly the other element of this is a wonderful woman, American therapist called Esther Perel, who wrote a really good book, very rare book from America, called Mating in Captivity, because she's actually a European by background, and she doesn't buy into this industry running in America around marriage counseling and around reining men in, keeping men sexuality controlled. And she's actually doing some interesting work around monogamy now, and arguing that, and she's always argued that third person in the relationship, if a man has an affair, he's seen as, although it's a huge threat to the marriage, as you say, in a sense, if he leaves, if he shows that he can escape, he is much more sexually attractive to her. So
hold the thought there for a sec. So you're saying that in a normal marriage, that's sort of dead sexually, if the man has an affair, this is good for the marital sex life, or can be?
No, well, essentially it's not, because the whole cultural dialogue is punish him, turf him out, why would you want a philandering man? I mean, we're doing a really good job punishing men if they do stray. But I'm saying
we punish them if they don't stray too, don't we?
Yeah, we punish you. You can't win. You must know that. But what Esther Perel is saying is that there's an erotic spark in the fact that someone else is interested in your man. And if it's just a flirtation, that can work. That you realize that other women find him interesting. It sparks up your attraction towards him. There's a sense you haven't got him, you may not have him totally under control. I mean, in that sense, it can really work for the marriage. But of course, if he's caught out having an affair, then that's it. With all the pressure now is on women to get rid of men like that. I mean, I just think that's an ordinary issue. But so you see, that's where I'm coming from. This idea, which some of your correspondents are playing with, that that when men are totally captured, we find them sexually unattractive. And
so is marriage just bad for men? Is marriage just bad for men? Is marriage bad for men? Period.
I think men love being married. I mean, I've spent all my life listening to men talking about
maybe
their
they're in love with a fantasy. The fantasy that marriage is.
No, many of them are in love with their wives. I mean, and men are. I mean, I think men can be so devoted to a woman they fall in love with, and the mother of their children, and the idea of family, and the idea of that whole concept is very attractive to men and very seductive to men, and they get terribly dependent on it because they put all their eggs in that basket. I mean, as we know, lots of men don't have enough friends. They don't have much of a social life that's independent of their marriage. We do a very good job as women stopping them having that. I'm always fascinated at how good women are telling men they're not allowed to have this friend or that friend or that, you know, or they're not allowed to go out and go sailing all weekend or play football. I mean, the men being on a very short leash, of course, is making the whole problem worse, but it means that men don't have many other friends or many other social activities. Getting lots and lots of men will say, my wife is my best friend, and genuinely mean that. And they love that. I mean, lots of men.
It sounds like it's not reciprocated. It sounds like it's not reciprocated within marriage.
It can be. I mean, you know, I know there are a lot.
I mean, what are the guys' chances for this to work out for them today? You know, we hear a lot about, like, a lot of failed marriages. Let's just say the number is 50% for round numbers. Of those 50% marriages that we say aren't failed, are they really successes, or are they just that grinding, living misery for a huge percentage of those so-called successful marriages? So I guess if a man has that desire for that happy family fantasy life or whatever, what are his chances of actually living that?
I think they're not great. And it makes me very nervous. I've got two sons. I've got a son who's just got married, just had a baby. And it really worries me. I just hope he's hit the jackpot with what I think is a lovely wife. But you never know. And you never know how things are going to play out. I think there's no question there are lots of extremely happily married men. All the research shows that men are much more easily content in their marriages. They're satisfied with less. They see themselves as having a good marriage in all sorts of circumstances where other people might look at that marriage and think, you know, he's not being well looked after. He still might really value the good parts of that marriage. But I think men generally are better at looking for the good things in a marriage, and we are extremely good at looking for at missing them and gnawing the bone, as our whole culture is teaching us to do, and really being critical of our relationships. And that's one of the biggest cultural problems we have.
I want to encourage viewers to write the questions, and I'm monitoring the comments in the live chat. So if you have questions, I'll try to capture them when they come up. Just print them in there. Just touching on that too, in the sexless marriage, you have some examples that go on for a long period of time. And you suggest that flirting could zing up the marriage. Why should these men just get out there and flirt right in front of their wives?
Yes, but as I've said, it's a two-edged sword. I mean, I think men have to do things to still be powerful in the relationship, to still be attractive, and that's a very difficult balance. There's a guy called Athol Kay you might want to look up. I can't remember the exact title of his book, but he's playing around with the idea of game in a marriage, of how do men reassert themselves, how do they keep something back, how do they tease women, take control sexually so that they still can induce that interest and spark in her. And I think that is we don't know enough about that, but we need to think more about that.
Sorry, if a wife or a woman knows that he's just gaming her, I mean, she's going to pick up on that. It's not real. It's going to lose its power, right? I mean, my first husband, I had a wonderful first marriage. Unfortunately, my husband died when he was very young. He was only 37, but he had that power. He had that sense of teasing me. You know, he was very much in control in certain aspects of our relationship, and it was very seductive. And I think there are very confident men who are managing that very well in relationships. But doesn't it mean for that confident man that in order to pull that off, he really does have to be really ready to end it because it's not working for him? Isn't that where the kernel of the sexual appeal is? The very fact that she really does realize he could just leave? Doesn't it have to seem real?
I think there's some truth in that, but you know, when you look at what he's up against, I mean, you know, the fact that every woman knows how much he has to lose if he leaves the marriage. And, you know, as Karen Strawn talks about, the absolute armory of weapons we are given as women to destroy that man if he chooses to leave a marriage where we don't want him to leave. You know, it's a big, you know, okay, there are men who still leave despite all of that, but they risk an enormous amount. So, and there's a real question of whether it's worth it for them. I think I mentioned, I can't remember when I put it in my video, I mentioned this, I once used to have this chat thing on my website when I was doing all this research around sex, and there was this letter from a man talking about, is it worth leaving a marriage for the sake of sex? And he had young children, and he knew he probably wouldn't be able to see those children or be a proper father to them if he, you know, that sort of. And there was this huge discussion, went on for weeks and weeks and weeks, for people weighing up that balance. And I had men in my research who left sexless marriages and said it was 100% worth it, and others who decided it wasn't worth the risk. And I think being a father is such a massive thing, and that's the biggest issue. That's the biggest thing that most men are balancing up. Is it worth losing my children for the sake of sex? And that's unfortunately what we're talking about here.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's just pause on that one for a minute. A lot of men, and not all, but a lot of men do want children. Now, I was with my son's mother for only 2.5 years. And the end of that relationship was the best thing for my parenting of my son. I would have been unable to be a father in any manner living with her. That was just out of the question. She was a clamp down, and I don't want to go any further than that. But anyways, what about this? Why don't men just forego the whole living with the mother thing, go straight directly with a woman to let's raise the children separately? Skip the marriage, skip the divorce, skip all that pain, have 2 households right from the beginning.
But if you're lucky enough to be able to have 2 households and share the children, I mean, it shows at some level she was a reasonable woman.
Who?
Your ex. I mean,
oh no! Don't make that assumption. No. It took 4.5 years in court with lawyers at a great expense to get shared custody, and then it was a fight for another 11 years after that. Okay, a total of 11 years in court, which included threats and real actions to take the child out of the country for good. Don't. No, sorry. Nightmare. Okay,
nightmare. As you know, that process crushes many men. A lot of men don't have enough money to employ the lawyers. I mean, a lot of men lose that battle, sadly, and I hear from them every day. So
they do.
I'm so pleased you won at great cost, obviously, but the reality is the figures clearly show that a lot of men are losing contact with it. Most men in that situation actually lose contact with their kids.
It's a death of 1,000 cuts if you stay in those bad marriages. It may be you might die by one slice off of your head by going away, but I don't think so. I think there's a sharp pain for sure, but you're your own person. You're your own person again.
And I have to say, there are wonderful women out there. I have to defend us now. I was having this not a men's men channel the other day, but a broader channel in Australia. I was doing a Q&A thing, and I had woman after woman writing in saying that women give me the shits, that they really object to the way women treat men, that they cannot understand why women aren't looking after them sexually, and boasting about how generous they are sexually to their husbands. I mean, there is a solid band of women out there who violently disagree with what's happening to men with regard to sex in marriage.
Absolutely, and I agree 100%. I don't mean to say paint everybody with one brush, but the crux of the matter is not the women themselves. There can be a lot of good women, but what happens when the relationship breaks down is dictated by the law, and it's the law that's really destroying men, because the law places this giant, total life-destroying gun right in the hand of every woman. Whether she's a good woman who would never use it or not, in a way, is kind of irrelevant. You know, but anyway, we wanted to get back to the sex thing, and there was Well, I don't mind this conversation. I think it's an important conversation.
I just want to say that's how I got into the whole men's rights thing, was starting off talking to men about sex and hearing about their marriages and hearing about their divorces. And that's why I've been fighting men's rights for 40 years. And it all started from sex, which is pretty funny, you know.
Well, sex is the drawing card that gets you into it all in the first place, right?
But also, the fact that, as I said, watching what's happened to men's sexual lives over the last 40 years, to me, absolutely epitomizes everything else as well. You know, that men have been done in by the system.
Let me ask you, one of our viewers here asked about MGTOW, and what are your thoughts on that? It's an open-ended question. What do you think the direction of MGTOW is, or your thoughts on MGTOW in general?
I think MGTOW is very important in lots of ways. I think it's totally understandable that men will make that decision to go it on their own, and to really avoid any sort of committed relationships with women. I hate the fact that a lot of men seem so antagonistic to women and to tar us all with the same brush in MGTOW. I'm always wanting to say we're not all like that. But I think it's reasonable, and I think it's potentially really powerful, because only when men really go on strike and say, why would we buy into your fantasy of marriage when this is what you're offering us, that women will start to hear. And that is going to be, I think if that movement really got powerful enough, then maybe we'd see women start to think about what they're doing.
Someone is saying here that the MGTOW just don't want to marry in these times. And that was my gut feeling about the MGTOW movement as well, is not so much that it's a movement against women, but it's really a movement away from the unfair laws and rules that govern structured relationships like marriage in particular. And some MGTOWs do take it as far as not have anything to do with women at all, not even to date. But I don't think that's that common. I could be wrong, but I think it's mostly about not living with, not getting married, not having the family thing, than avoiding women altogether. But no question, I think you do see an element of painting all women with the same brush within that movement as well. I just wanted to throw that in there.
I think that's right. And that, that is a good compromise, but the problem in there is the children thing. It's pretty hard in a casual it's extremely hard in a casual relationship to have children that you then have any chance of being a real father to, and that you're not going to be, making the argument that you have a right to still retain a fathering relationship after that relationship breaks up is much harder in a casual relationship, as we know.
Sorry, go ahead.
And I was going to say, one of the issues that's always really bothered me is, of course, men get involved with women with children. So they get involved with other people's children, fall for those children, care for those children, and then the rug is just immediately pulled out from under them. And after talking to so many heartbroken men who have committed themselves to caring for someone else's children, and then have no relationship with them as a result of her deciding in its life anymore. In their lives either.
I'm sure that could be very traumatic, yeah.
So hopping mad about the way our societies are operating, and that's one of them.
I want to go back to one thing you said when I suggested why not forego living together and just have children if that's what you want, two separate households. And you have a valid point that, yeah, it's more expensive, but keep in mind that when two people meet each other, a woman and a man, and they date, they have two separate households already. They're running their lives. And in my experience, this idea that raising a child is horrendously difficult or horrendously expensive is crazy. It's not that hard. It's not that difficult to manage, and it's not that expensive. It's a little bit more expensive and a little bit less free time. Of course, it depends on what you expect to give to your kids. Sure, it's a little more expensive, but here's the thing too. Let's say, but before I let you off of this, if half of the marriages end, you could be in that position anyway, in an even worse financial position. So why not, for those men who want children but don't want to have the whole risk of living together and whatnot, why not seek out a partner who will do it, boom, from the beginning? Let's just agree to forego all that crap. We'll raise a child separately from the word go. And how many women would go for that, do you think?
Well, I would argue that's not ultimately in children's interests. I think there's really good research and anecdotal evidence to suggest the ideal situation for children is having two parents together.
Yeah,
because you can. I know, but when it does mainly happen, still most families, touch wood, I mean, we're still in a situation where most kids are spending most of their lives with two parents. In Australia, I don't know what the figures are there, but and that mothers provide things and fathers provide things. And a good look, if we're going to teach children how to get on, how men and women should get on with each other, watching that in a marriage with a loving pair of parents, showing them how to deal with each other, how to care for each other, how to deal with conflict and sort it out. I mean, nothing is better for children than that.
Well, let me throw this out, Kate. I said before, we talked before, roughly 50% of these marriages are going to end in acrimony. Of those marriages that don't end in acrimony, they survive in acrimony, probably 80% of those. So how good really is this role model of mother and father getting along together? You don't see a whole lot of that, like Leave It to Beaver marriages or whatever those, what was that famous old show where, I forget that guy's name, but happy family thing, you know?
Yeah.
How many really good role model happy families are there out there?
I think you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, saying let's just start at the other end. I do. I mean, look, it's worth trying to offer children some of that. I still think that's true.
But can't you offer it? So living in two separate households.
Let me talk to you about sex. Have you ever talked to other men about the sort of issue we're talking about? The whole sex starve thing?
I have to think long and hard about that. I would say yes, a couple of guys I know very closely. Yeah.
Otherwise, you just make jokes about it. And
no, one fellow. I don't want to say too much about him because somebody watching might actually know him, but was genuinely like stressed and hadn't had sex or intimacy in his marriage forever. And this is one of the reasons why when I watch your video, just like ringing bells, you know, I just thinking of a couple of guys that I talked to about this, and it was really stressed. And they really felt like they're literally begging, and it's really humiliating. You could see the humiliation in them. Yeah.
What do you think about the whole issue of pleasing women? If you're with a new woman, do you find that daunting? I mean, how do you feel about the idea that you're with someone? Do you think women do a good job teaching men how to make love to them?
I don't think so. No, I don't think they want to say anything in general. They want to receive. In my experience, they just want you to know what to do.
What does that feel like from a male point of view?
I'm sorry?
What does that feel like from the male point of view?
Well, I'm not the most experienced guy in the world, you know, but I mean, I had some experience in my younger days. Of course, a new relationship is really, really exciting, right? Everything is new. So whatever happens is exciting, whether it, you know, it's just all one barrel of excitement in the first few months. But I can't say that very many women in my experience would actually say anything about what you should do. In one instance, yeah, I can think of a woman who has more open about talking about things like that. But women I think are pretty shy about saying anything.
When the woman who was more open, did you like that?
I'm sorry?
The woman who was more open, did you like it when she was?
I've changed over my life. I was really kind of shy in my earlier, you know, when I was a young man. So there was a girlfriend or two who were very aggressive, you might say. And sometimes, yeah, it's good. But I guess I was put off by one of them in particular, that I didn't really think it didn't feel good to me to be quite so aggressive. But as I get older, you appreciate it because it's a lot less work.
And I suppose it's a way, I like to think there are ways of doing it, you know. It should be more about reward than punishment.
Yeah.
Encouraging, yes, that feels good, keep doing that. Rather
I'm
than
sure the whole dating scene today is entirely different from when I grew up, because you hear stuff of what's going on in the high schools today, and you know, some ways it sounds like a lot of the high school girls are ready to be porn stars right off the bat.
Yeah, look, I think there's so much nonsense being talked about young people because there's this concept that they're all so cool and out there and into everything, and it's not true. I find talking to young people, most of them are as embarrassed and awkward about the sort of stuff we're talking about as we were. I mean, if I go out to talk to an audience about sex, I find it's easier to talk to a group of 70-year-olds than it is to talk to a group of 30-year-olds. If I'm talking about erections.
Did you say 70 or 17?
70. I went to talk at a ball. It was a charity ball a few years ago, and it was raising money for prostate cancer. And I did my usual thing. This is one of my big passions, is talking about why men going through prostate cancer treatments aren't being looked after properly when it comes to their erections. You know, there's this whole process of what they call penile rehabilitation, which you probably even haven't heard about, have you, Steve?
No, I haven't.
No one ever talks about it.
So just to be clear here, I'm unclear on this whole thing about prostate treatment too. Like it affects your sex life, I take it, does it?
Well, it's not the prostate cancer, it's the treatments. Most of the treatments will affect your sex life, but the chances of regaining your normal erections are much better if you have what they call penile rehabilitation, if you're given means of getting artificial erections through various drug treatments and so on.
Like Viagra sort of thing?
Viagra, but more likely, I know you're going to turn pale, injection therapy. Men are really problematic when it comes to the idea of injecting their best friends. But
they inject in there?
They inject in there. It's not nearly as scary as it sounds.
It doesn't sound good to me.
It doesn't sound good to me. To most men, when I would talk to audiences of men, they turn very pale at the thought of this. In fact, men, when they've talked to me about doing it, it's a tiny little needle, like the diabetics use, and it's like a pinprick. It's nothing. I once had a relationship with this man. You know, I did online dating for a while and had a number of new relationships. And I was really excited when I discovered one of them was a man who'd had prostate cancer and had surgery. And he was using this injection therapy. So I had a chance to see it firsthand.
So it's more than one injection then?
Yeah, you have an injection. Every time you want an erection, you use this injection.
Every time?
Yeah, every time. Whoa. But it gives you this really good erection, believe me. There you go.
But is it just physical, or is there the same pleasure associated with it? Like, what's the point of having an erection if it doesn't, you know?
Of course. Look, I think we're going to have to do a whole session on looking after erections one day. Yeah, of course it's, well, the basic point I'm trying to make about all of this is men don't know anything. Look at you. You are at an age where the chances of you having prostate cancer at some point are very high. Yeah, and men are not taught to look after their bodies, and they're not taught to look after their erections. So men who've had prostate cancer surgery might have trouble with erections. They can still have a climax. They can still have an orgasm. And they're often not even told that. They won't ejaculate. Okay? You're looking away, Steve.
Well, in part, I'm trying to keep an eye on the comments, and the general feeling in the comment is that needles, sharp things don't belong down there, you know?
Well, believe me, they can really be. They're one of the approaches to this problem that can really work. And if you're not getting erections,
it's great to hear this information.
Go back. I was talking about this charity ball I was talking about. talking to, and I thought they'd be all 70-year-olds or 60-year-olds because prostate cancer. And it turned out they were all 20 and 30-year-olds, you know, young people who wanted to get dressed up in ball gowns. And so I faced this audience. Well, here I was talking to this audience of young people about erections. If those males could have dug a hole in the ground to get away from me, they would have. They were so embarrassed. And the girls were just hopeless too. And it just shows this, the idea that young people are so cool and relaxed about talking about sex is total rubbish.
Mm.
And men of your age, men over 50, who should know a lot more about what's going to happen in terms of looking after that wonderful piece of equipment you have there, are hopeless too. And that's part of my job, is to teach men to become more comfortable about talking about something that should be a natural part of life.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it for most men.
You are really lucky.
I'm sorry?
You live in this age of Viagra. You live in an age where there are really good treatments, and most men are not being given those treatments when they should.
Well, I think for a lot of men, they don't look into it until it becomes a like in-your-face problem, you know. Yeah. But you're right that there's not much education about these things out there. I mean, everybody knows about Viagra because, you know, it's on the advertisements all the time. But this injection thing and this idea, what happens with prostate cancer and all that, there's not much is known to men. Not like we know about breast cancer, you know.
Well, that's part of the problem.
Knows about breast cancer now and what happens.
But prostate cancer is more common than breast cancer. Breast cancer gets all the funding.
Right.
We have, in Australia, we have like 5 times more breast cancer nurses than prostate cancer nurses working in the communities. We give no money at all, no government money at all to the cost of restoring their penises after prostate cancer surgery. And we give massive amounts of money to helping women having breast reconstructions and prostheses after mastectomy. Now, there's no question in my mind that the loss of a breast, in terms of the effects on her femininity, are very similar to the feelings that men have in terms of the attack on their masculinity from losing their.
Isn't it even worse for men? Like if your equipment doesn't work, there's no sex.
Yes, there can be. There can be. You know,
oh, really?
I mean, men can. Well, one of the interesting things here. Okay, you're not getting erections. Obviously, you can still have sexual pleasure. You can reach orgasm. It's quite and
without an erection, you can reach orgasm.
Well, that's the thing. It's quite hard to have an orgasm without an erection, but it can happen. But I would argue that men, even on their own, men not in relationships, should be given treatments so that they can have decent erections to masturbate. And no doctors ever talk about that either.
No.
I mean, why wouldn't you at least want that pleasure? Yeah. It's quite hard to masturbate a flaccid penis, isn't it?
I would think so, yeah.
You know, but I mean, there's issue after issue after issue where
but there's no research. Men
aren't getting the information they need.
Yeah, but there's no research on treatments anyways. It's like 1/10 of the money spent on prostate cancer research versus breast cancer research, right? At this point, I think a woman can go in and have complete reconstructive surgery, and I don't know how good it works, but it's there, right?
Yeah. That can be very effective, but also as I said, some of these erection treatments can work really well too. We have in Australia this organisation called Movember. You know, I don't know whether it's come over here, where people go.
Movember is all over the world.
I think it started in Australia. Yeah. Billions of dollars they're raising. I have battered their doors down saying, why aren't you doing anything about sex? You know, they are so squeamish. They are pouring money into this and that and the other to do with prostate cancer. And men say to me, you know, obviously the initial thing when you realize you have prostate cancer is the big C. Am I going to live? Am I going to survive? But so many men say once they've had this treatment, you know, been through that process, the next thing they think about is sex. I mean, what better way to celebrate being alive than having a good bonk? I mean, let's face it. And also lots of couples, when they're going through that process, women can be very supportive to their men when they're facing prostate cancer, and the good relationships can really get really close. And in that situation, the fact that they're not giving any help with regaining their sex life is just appalling. And I'd love to do, one day I'll do a whole video on this, and maybe we can have another chat about it, Steve, because I think it's a really important area.
Definitely. You know, and it's such a rare to have the conversation at all. I got a question here from somebody. I think it's a serious question. Are there any health benefits to either way versus like masturbating or just abstinence? Is there a difference health-wise for either of those paths?
Masturbating is probably better for you. In terms of the prostate, there's clear evidence that prostate health is improved by regular orgasms, regular, you know, going through the process of arousal and orgasm and ejaculation. And so researchers have recommended masturbation as a regular thing if you're not having any other sexual outlet particularly. Abstinence is not, I mean, I don't think abstinence is bad for you, but I think sex is good for you.
Right.
You know, it's a reason, you know, all the nonsense is talked about.
So what's with the war on porn then? What's that all about?
Oh, that's all driven by the feminine. That's part of the anti-male sexuality diatribes that are gripping our society. Pornography. Look at 50 Shades of Grey. All right. Here was this book that swept the world, that was absolutely celebrated as this wonderful thing because women were discovering their sexuality and they were reading this erotic literature, and all these therapists came out and said this is fantastic. And they said, oh, no, it doesn't mean that women are into S&M and wanting to be tied up and whipped. Women can distinguish between reality and fantasy. And this was Mommy's little secret, and how wonderful that was. And what's Daddy's little secret? Daddy's little secret is porn, which of course is visual sexual material, and that's disgusting and depraved, and it means he's heading down the slippery slope towards becoming a sex addict, and he's betraying his marriage, and so on. I mean, this is all being driven by a feminist argument which is anti-male sexuality, and it drives me crazy.
Yeah, I think you're right there. What about this this female rape fantasy thing? How big is that? How widespread is it? Is it real? Do women commonly have a rape fantasy, and how widespread is this? How important is it?
Look, it's always been there. There was a famous books back in the 1970s, one of them called My Secret Garden by Nancy Friday. I mean, she went out and just collected women's sexual fantasies. And there was everybody who's ever done that, Sherry Hyde was another sex researcher who did that. The rape fantasy always features prominently as one of the scenarios that turn women on. If you look at this huge industry of romance, chick lit, the bodice rippers, the sort of mildly erotic novels that sell millions and millions across the world, that idea of being, or the whole classic, even the whole fairy tale Beauty and the Beast, the idea of this dominant man, the woman taming this dominant man, and in there is this element of threat, being with a man who could.
It ties into the same power theme that you were talking about before, like that. Obviously, the man's not under her control if she's, fantasizing.
And if you read the feminist literature too, they wrestle with this because they find women's. They have to try to explain it away. How is it that women are still thinking about being dominated sexually, and why are we doing that? It's there. I mean, it's only one scenario. Not all women think like that, but it's certainly a very powerful erotic thought for many women, I think.
There's a question here. Someone is suggesting that there's a lot of scientific research or evidence building that porn is highly addictive. What do you think on that?
I think it's rubbish. I mean, it's a pleasurable activity, and of course, any pleasurable activity has the potential to take over your life. You can become very addicted to golf, can't you? hitting little white balls into holes because it's fun and you enjoy it and you achieve something, you feel good. Men using pornography, it's pleasurable, it's associated with masturbation, it's associated with having orgasms. And of course, depending on what else is happening in your life, you might want to do it an awful lot. Look at Philip Roth, you know, famous author, wrote Portnoy's Complaint, which talked about, you know, the fact he was masturbating 17 times a day, whatever it was. That is the norm.
Hold on. Did you say 17 times a day?
Philip Roth, remember that famous novel?
I don't recall anything about.
Portnoy's
Complaint. Even possible?
Famous novel about a young man who the classic was he masturbated using his mother's piece of liver she had in the fridge. You don't know, you have to go and read that. This is an absolute classic. But he was obsessed by masturbation. That was part of the story. And well, I can't remember how we got onto that. Anyway.
Scientific evidence suggesting porn is addictive.
No. And all this notion that it changes your brain chemistry. There is, if you talk to a proper neurologist about that, this is all a beat up. There is no evidence that it changes your brain. Certainly it's true that it can be very compulsive because it's extremely pleasurable, and lots of men do an awful lot of looking at porn because they enjoy it. And men have always had, if you look at all the research on sexual desire in men are much more driven by the difference, you know, the idea of being with different women. Men show much more interest in sexual variety than women do. They're much more interested in sexually unusual things than women are. All of that is part of the intrinsic sexual nature of a man, and pornography caters to that. Now, men who don't use pornography still have all that stuff in their heads. They still have that difference. They're just choosing not to indulge it in the same way as men who use a lot of pornography. But pornography has always been there. I had this man, right, you know, when I was doing my research, who said, you know, how he used to leap on the Sunday newspapers when they were being delivered because there might be underwear catalogues included in there. And that was the nearest he got to looking at, you know, something sexual. That if you look throughout history, men have sought out visual images of naked women throughout history. And it's just that we now have this wonderful source of lots and lots of naked women on the internet. And I'm not remotely surprised that some men are overindulging. But, you know, get back to the point I made probably an hour ago, was that's easy. Pleasing women is really hard. And people ask why men prefer pornography.
Right. Well, let's see if we got some more questions in the thing here. We've been going on now over an hour. Did you know that?
I know. I mean, I probably should go and do some real work.
No, it's a great conversation, and there's an engaging chat going on.
Good.
What are you working on now? What's your current interests?
Oh, well, I'm currently writing a big article about this whole rubbish around the campus rape frenzy, the idea that there are all these rapists out on Australia. In Australia, we're in the midst of this amazing campaign where the feminists have been, you know, following exactly down the same track as happened in America. We had our Shonky survey from the Union of Students, who said 73% of women, young students, reported being sexually assaulted or, you know, unwanted sexual activity. And now we have our Human Rights Commission doing $1 million survey, which is being released next week, which is going to show they're artificially inflating all the stats by, you know, including men staring at women, sexual jokes. And then there's going to be this enormous announcements about the number of rapists on campuses. Our universities are already on their knees, promising sexual assault units, promising 24-hour hotlines for all these rapists who are going to come out of the woodwork.
Well, the latest is 137% of men are rapists. Did you know that?
Yeah, I know that. Now, and I've got this fabulous idea. I'm actually Australia is particularly dependent on overseas students. One of our big universities, Melbourne University, 37% of their funding comes from overseas students, mainly from Asia. And I'm going to go to spokespeople in India and Malaysia and countries which send a lot of students over here and say, why would you be coming to Australia if there are all these rapists on campus? This is the big, I mean, I'm going to be going to every vice chancellor in Australia and saying, how can you scare off overseas students through this cooked up bullshit about a rape culture on campus? What are you doing to our university sector?
Do you think anybody really believes that, or is it just that everybody says it and everybody agrees to it, but nobody believes it? I mean,
I don't think anybody believes it, but the feminists are very powerful.
Oh yeah.
As of course, Janice, wonderful Janice Fiamengo exposes week after week what's happening on campuses, and the same is happening in Australia. And what, of course, as she says, all the administrators, all the academics are too nervous to speak out. It's the emperor's new clothes issue. No one wants to say this is all rubbish. They think that by appeasing the feminists with this latest round of virtue signaling exercises, they're going to shut them up for a while. And it's just rubbish. They're already talking about how to get the universities to adjudicate these cases, as happened in America with their tribunal system. Which of course is now being wound,
right?
Yeah, which is going to be wound back by Trump. Thank God Trump is looking at that and saying, what a lot of rubbish. This is costing $700 million in America. They're fighting these endless lawsuits that have come out of these shonky tribunals.
There's a comment.
So it goes on. That's my new campaign. I'm having great fun in Australia.
That's a big one. I mean, this whole rape culture lie it's a huge topic, and it's a giant rabbit hole. You're going to end up going down there. There's a comment here. One fellow says rape culture hysteria is proof of rape fantasy in women. What do you think about that?
No, I think that's true. No, I don't think that's right. I mean, I think it's proof that talking about rape is, it's like, it's something that people can't argue against, because if it's a sort of apple pie issue that the feminists have found works really well for them, like domestic violence, exactly the same thing. There are certain issues the feminists have found gain a lot of public sympathy, and hardly anyone ever dares properly address them. And
no one wants to be accused of defending rapists, right?
Rape apologists.
Yeah,
but I mean, the academic thing is really important to me. I come from a family of academics. My father was a very famous professor. He has a building named after him in one of our leading universities, and he will be turning in his grave at the fact that the universities are so lily-livered and have they're lying on their backs with their legs in the air to the, saying to the feminists, come and get us. And he would be outraged by that.
There's no question about that. There's a profound and obvious lack of backbone in academia administration, and in faculty as well. The faculty, very, very few faculty members are willing to risk their $200,000 a year professor salary by saying anything to upset feminists.
I know. And it is time we started fighting back, as Janice always says. And I was so pleased to discover the Fiamengo files, and she's doing a wonderful job for you. But I'm over here on the other side of the world fighting much the same fight. And it's very encouraging to find fellow women involved in all of this.
And there are the growing number of women, and welcome to the group, by the way. It's wonderful to have your voice. You're the first person that I saw talk so clearly on such an important matter as sex-starved husbands and sexless marriages. The points you made in there, I think, ring true to a lot of men watching. So thank you very much for that one.
Pleasure, Steve.
And welcome to Studio Brûlée as our newest contributor.
And I look forward to more talks in the future.
Terrific. Well, once again, is there anything else you want to add before we sign off, Bettina?
No, anyway, that's from me. We'll talk again.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for watching. That's Bettina Arndt. And in the low bar, you'll see links to her website and her YouTube channel and Patreon page. So do check her out. There'll be lots of new and interesting material. And as Bettina just mentioned, her newest interest is this idea of rape culture on campuses in Australia. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and good night. And check with us next week. We'll have regular live streams. Tomorrow is the Liberty Bells. Tune in for that as well. Good night, everyone.